Hey guys, what's up? So today we're going to be talking about glacial erosion and deposition. So we're going to talk about what a glacier is, and we're going to talk about the different ways that it can erode the land that it's riding across. Okay, it's going to be a lot of terms, a lot of vocabulary. So this is going to be definitely one of those videos that if you want to stop it, rewind it, make sure you get all the terms. There's going to be lots of pictures. Okay, so make sure you're paying attention to it. Okay, glaciers are super important, especially for us here in New York. Lots of other places around the world as well, if you happen to be watching it there. Okay, but after you watch this, you should actually be able to see, especially if you go outside of the urban areas of like New York and stuff. But if you look at the rest of our state, okay, or other places around the world, you can actually tell that a glacier has been there, even if it's not there today, based on some of the stuff you're going to hear in this lesson. All right, guys? So without further ado, let's go. All right, so the first thing we want to talk about is, well, what is a glacier? If we're going to talk about glacial erosion, we need to know what a glacier itself actually is. So a glacier is defined as a moving body of ice that forms on land. Very important. It has to be something that forms on the land from the accumulation, compaction, and recrystallization of snow. I'll explain what that means in a minute, okay? And it tends to form at a point where the snow stays throughout the year. So we're not talking about glaciers don't form in the winter and then disappear. No, we're talking about glaciers are these big masses of ice that are going to form above what we call the snow line. Okay, and the snow line is the point where the snow never melts. So where the air temperature stays cold enough that the ice will just sit there, the snow will just sit there for a long period of time. Now, how do you get from snow to ice? Well, it's relatively simple. If you look at the picture in front of you, this shows you the process. When snow falls, most of the snow that falls on the ground is actually air. It's full of air, empty air, okay? That's why when you play tackle football or playing around the snow, you can fall into a snowdrift and it doesn't hurt because it's cushioned, okay? So when snow first falls, it falls as snowflakes like you see in the picture, okay? And it's full of air. Now, we all know, living in New York, when snow falls the first day, it's beautiful, it's nice. But after a couple days, what starts to happen to those piles of snow? Okay, well, the weight of the snow on top squishes the snow on the bottom. And so what starts to happen is you start to squish out some of the air. Okay, you also start to lose the pretty little crystals and start to turn more into just ice. We all know this happens, right? If you go to shovel your car out or your driveway and you haven't touched it in a few days, you hit a big mass of ice. Why? Because you've gone from snow, which is mostly air, to this thing that we call granular ice. And it's all because of just the weight on top adding pressure to the stuff on the bottom. Okay, now that's the worst that we get here in New York. But imagine the snow never went away. Imagine years and years worth of snow just piling on top of each other. Well, we'd get to the next stage, which you see on the chart as Föhn. Föhn is literally a German word meaning last year's snow. Okay, and what happens is effectively that you just get more layers and more layers. And so you keep squeezing and squeezing and squeezing air and squeeze the air out and just left with more and more ice. And eventually you see the little picture on the side, it gets less and less shaped like a star or a snowflake. And eventually you end up with the glacial ice. Now this can take years to form. And eventually you will end up with just this big mass of very heavy but very pure ice with very little air in it. Which is why if you look at the picture here, this is a glacier. Now, all the stuff that you see on it is the sediment that it's been carrying, so you can actually see the process of erosion here, okay? But you can see the glacial ice, this is stuff that has been sitting there for years and hundreds, sometimes thousands of years worth of snow and ice just piling on top of each other. You can see these if you ever go up to Alaska or places like that, okay? You can see these beautiful glaciers that stretch out for miles, and the ice that you're looking at is sometimes centuries old. All right, so how do these glaciers move? Because remember, the thing with erosion is we have to be able to move the sediment. So the glacier itself, this big mass of ice, has to move. Well, the main thing that's going to cause the glacier to move is gravity. Most glaciers are going to tend to form at higher altitudes, okay, where you have this accumulation of snow, okay, in an area that we call the zone of accumulation. Okay, so it's going to build up there, and gravity is going to pull that snow down. As more and more glacial ice forms, it's going to get pulled down. And so glaciers tend to move in a downward motion along the slopes of hills or mountains or wherever they happen to be, from higher elevation towards sea level. Now, as this happens, of course, you're going to get melting and things like that. And eventually, when you hit the sea, you're going to start to break apart. The ocean is going to break you apart. But glaciers tend to move in this downward movement as a combination of their own weight and gravity. All right, so now onto the actual concept of erosion. So as a glacier is dragging itself along a mountainside or the ground or wherever it happens to be moving, it's going to erode the ground underneath it, the bedrock beneath it. It's going to pick up chunks of rock, it's going to pick up chunks of sand, it's going to even pick up chunks of soil like we talked about with transported soils. And it's going to carry that sediment and that soil as far as it can go. Now, because glaciers are so big and so heavy, they can carry all kinds of sediment. It can carry everything from the tiniest little bit of silt to boulders the size of somebody's car. Some of this stuff is going to get dragged underneath. Some of this stuff may actually get locked inside the glacier. Some of it may be on the side. Some of it may be on the top. But the glacier is basically just a gigantic, for lack of a better term, snow shovel. And it's just scooping up everything. So imagine if you take a snow shovel and you put it on the ground and you just push it forward, what's going to start happening? Everything that edge of the shovel comes in contact with is just going to start piling up. Some of it's going to pile up on the front, some of it's going to stick to the bottom of the shovel, some of it's going to be pushed up along the sides of it. And so what ends up happening is you just get a ton of material getting carried by your glacier. And so you can see it in the picture that you've been looking at. This is a glacier. Now it looks like it's all dirt and sand. Well, that's because this glacier, a lot of it has melted and deposited a lot of stuff. But in the glaciers themselves, you can see it has dropped a ton of material. And you can see some of the particles you can see even from this high altitude that this picture was taken. And some of them are going to be incredibly small. So glaciers can eat away at just about any loose rock. If you're loose, if you're a sediment, if you've been weathered away, and a glacier comes, it's taking you away. All right, so one way in which glaciers erode is through abrasion. We talked about abrasion. Abrasion is when you have one thing rubbing up against another thing and the rock gets broken up due to the friction and you end up with lots of little particles. Now, the glacier is going to do this as it moves along the ground or as it moves down the side of a hill and rubs against that hill. You're going to rub the ice against the rock, against the bedrock, and you're going to pick up tons and tons of sediment and you're going to move this sediment. Some of this stuff gets carried inside, some of it gets carried along the bottom. Eventually, when the glacier starts to melt, what you're going to produce is this substance that we call rock flour, okay? And you can actually see it in the picture that you're looking at right now. Here you have a massive glacier that has cut away at all those mountains in the background, this valley that you can see. But if you look at the picture here, you can actually see how it's starting to melt. Well, when it's starting to melt, if we zoom in on that little spot where it's starting to melt, you can actually see here all the material that's coming out of this spot. All the dirt, all the grime, all the sand, all the silt, all this stuff. It looks like flour. It looks like flour in water, okay? And so this is what we call rock flour, and this would be one way in which the glacier has eroded. That material probably came from the rocks in the background, but has now gotten transported to this, and through the water is going to get transported even further. The second form of glacial erosion is what we call plucking or coring. And in this case, what you're actually doing is instead of just taking tiny little bits off, you're actually ripping rock fragments out of the bedrock and carrying them along as the ice flows down. So this is how coring actually works. So what you have here is you have the glacial ice, this is the light blue that you see here, okay, on top of the bedrock. And here you have bedrock that's got like different hills and things like that. Now, the bedrock's naturally going to have cracks in it. We talked about this before. Okay, you get all sorts of cracks happening here and here and here. Well, as the glacier moves over that, some of the friction is going to cause some of the water to melt. When that water melts, it's going to enter the cracks. When it enters the cracks, okay, it's going to fill those cracks, but it's surrounded by ice. So what's going to happen? It's going to freeze. When it freezes, it's going to cause those to expand. What do we call that? Frost action. And so what you're going to start getting is over here, you're not going to get a lot of it, but down here, you're going to get a whole ton of it going on. And so what starts to happen is chunks get broken off. Now, the glacier is moving. As the glacier is moving, as it's flowing, it's going to pick up those chunks and it's going to drag them down. So it's literally, we call it plucking, okay, or coring, like we're digging it out. And also those rock fragments are going to help with the abrasion. You can actually see it right there. So these rock fragments are going to drag along this. You actually can see that sometimes in rock that's had glaciers go across it. It looks like it has scratch marks because of all these rocks that got plucked and got stuck in the ice, and it's going to move them downhill. And eventually what you're going to end up with is this area. Okay, this area is abraded and it's eroded. There used to be rock here. It's no longer there. It got eroded and carried away. All right, so now once all this plucking and abrasion has gone on, what happens to the ground? Well, the thing about glaciers you have to remember is glaciers are going to dramatically change the land that they pass through and over. Okay, glaciers are actually going to create what we call glacial landforms. They are going to alter the ground dramatically as they pass across it. Specifically, they're going to tend to alter things like river valley. most glaciers are going to tend to follow old pre-existing river valleys, and they're going to change what they look like. Okay, they're going to create what we call a glacial trough, and they're going to create a bunch of other different features as well. So if you're looking at this picture, you actually see the first image that you see is what the landscape looks like before the glacier went through. So you've got some mountains, you've got a river that you can see going through, and rivers are going to tend to carve V-shaped valleys. That's really important. Remember that. Okay, so this is an area of unglaciated topography. We talked about that, topography, the hills, the mountains, and stuff like that. Now, let's say an ice age happens or something occurs, and a glacier fills this valley. Well, what the glacier is going to do is, you can see it dramatically is going to open up that valley. Okay, you see how much wider it is down on the bottom, the main glacier. Now you've got the main glacier and you've got a bunch of other little smaller glaciers. That main glacier and those smaller glaciers are going to change the shape of the mountains. They're going to sharpen certain points, they're going to widen other points, and they're going to create a dramatically different feature. Now, imagine a glacier is there for 100 years or 1,000 years. It's going to dramatically affect it. But let's say the temperatures change, the ice age ends, and the glacier melts away. Well, the glacier might be gone, but the land is going to be forever changed to reflect that the glacier was there. And even though it's not there anymore, we can look at it and figure it out. If you look at the next image, you can see this is what the world would look like after the glacier has gone. Okay, glaciers are going to create these big, wide, U-shaped valleys that we call a glacial trough. If you see a U-shaped valley, that is an indicator that at some point in the past, that valley was full of a glacier. If you go upstate to New York, places like Lake George and stuff like that, you will see that a lot of the valleys aren't these steep valleys, they're these very wide, U-shaped, bowl-shaped valleys. You will get places that look like the picture in front of you. This is a U-shaped. U-shapes are indicators of glaciers. That's incredibly important to write down. A U-shaped valley indicates that a glacier was present, indicates that a glacier did the erosion. A U-shaped valley is what we call a glacial trough. Alright guys, so that is where I'm going to end this glacial video. There's going to be a bunch more stuff on landforms that we'll do in the next lesson, but that is where I want to end for today. Alright guys, so I hope you all have a good night, and I will talk to you guys later. Peace out, stay cool.